Hi, in this video I'm going to show a summary of this paper about a new Halide autoscheduler for GPUs. This is done in collaboration with Andrew Adams, who developed what could be the best autoscheduler for CPUs. The work done in this autoscheduler, labeled as Anderson 2021, I think, in the codebase, in the Halide codebase, is extending the Adams 2019 autoscheduler. One of the main difference with Adams is that the Adams autoscaler, as mentioned before, is targeted for CPUs. This one is targeted for GPUs. The cost model is going to have GPU features, GPU hardware target features, and also is going to do some strategies, the one mentioned here, to improve the search, to make the search more efficient. For example, it's going to free some profitable segments of the schedules, so that the search can focus on the most important parts of the schedule, the most profitable ones, and reduce the state space basically, and then gradually stop unfreeze the other regions of the schedule so that it can have a manageable amount of samples to search through. Also has the concept of hierarchical sampling, so the schedules are grouped by similarity, so that way the state space also gets reduced, and it is common that some of sub-schedule computations are repeated, so memoizing is used to avoid this recomputation. And yeah, basically it's an improvement over Adams in the sense that it's able to support GPUs, but also there was another GPU Halide autoscheduler from Ciutas, and the compile time through these three strategies here is improved significantly. So it's improving over both Adams and Ciutas in that sense. And the author mentioned that image and vision programs require particular attention to long-range fusion and trading redundant recomputation and reducing the bandwidth and greater locality. That's a common theme of the triangle trade-off mentioned by Ragg and Kelly back in 2013. So the average compile time, because of the pruning that I just mentioned, is 49x speedup up to 530x. And yeah, I mentioned already the three strategies to improve the searching, and it's able to evaluate thousands of schedules per second versus seconds to minutes. Is a significant speed up, as mentioned here, for the compile time. And yeah, also like Adams is able to offer three types of workflows. One of them is just to use the train model without actually profiling the Halide code. I mean the profiling in the target. So that is faster, but it's the less performing one. Then you have the other extreme, in which you basically continually improve the cost model through training and getting profiling data. That takes longer of time to compile, but is the most performing. And then you have something like top 5 that is in between these two extremes. I'm going to talk more about that later. The geometric speedup is 1.x, so in addition to improve the compile time over Ciutas, is also able to improve the speedup of the actual program, the runtime efficiency, and it is quite close, 0.9x over the best human expert over the manually optimized Halide code. One thing to consider that he's going to mention later is that the manually implemented schedule for Halide are considering GPU primitives that the autoscaler is not including. So if the autoscaler includes those old primitives available, then maybe it could beat the manually optimized Halide code. Also, one good thing to consider is that sometimes the person can optimize a Halide algorithm, a small one, but when the pipeline is large, the image processing pipeline is large, then it is it might be impossible for the human to come up with an optimal strategy. Uh, yeah, as I mentioned before, the cost model is going to include GPU hardware features, and they train their cost model, their deep learning based cost model for the autoscaler. They train it with random pipelines, but also they use real world applications. The author in this section, called "Why is Scalability a Problem," is going to show that the search space for finding the optimal schedule for Halide algorithms is quite large. So, but before then, I'm gonna give a brief background on GPUs architectures because it's gonna mention it in the paper. In GPUs, there's a concept of thread blocks, which executes in a streaming processor, and you can see it in here. SM is a streaming multiprocessor that has a shared memory. So when you execute at the thread block level, you're gonna have a shared memory to where you can put your computations. And within it, you have a series of cores, and the threads executes at the core level where you have the registers. So at that level, you store your computations. You can store your computations in the registers, and you can have SIMD within those cores at the instruction level. And there's a concept of warp, which is a group of threads. For example, it could be 32. It's a group of threads that are going to execute in a SIMD instruction. So when you do the search of this schedule, the schedule for an algorithm, for a particular algorithm, you're gonna look for the right balance between these triangle trade-off of parallelism, locality, and redundant work. So you might, yeah. So you're gonna have your scale space gonna be somewhere between there. So in this example, we're gonna use an hypothetical two-stage algorithm with no particular computation, where the intermediate is computation is the producer, and the output is gonna be the consumer. So this is another view of the same algorithm. So you're gonna have an input, and you're gonna apply a stencil computation, and that's going to produce the outputs of the intermediate computation, and then you're going to apply another stencil computation. A stencil computation is basically an operation in which a particular pixel of the output depends on a window region, a square window region of the input tensor, the input matrix. So the typical choices that are using the autoscheduler for the innermost thread dimension. So you can see in here that one of the most complicated, sorry for changing back, one of the most complicated part of finding the schedule is the tiling, because it has a lot of options. So in here, we're tiling the blocks. So initially, going back to the initial algorithm, you can see that the producer has only one loop with columns and rows, and the producer has only one for loop. So we can tile this, and when we tile the for loop, we're gonna enable other optimizations like vectorization, unrolling, parallelization, etc. So that's one of the main optimizations that an autoscaler has to pay attention to. So when we tile, we now have the outermost for loop that executes at the block level, while the innermost execute at the thread level. And if we go back to the GPU diagram, you can see that the outermost is going to be at the block level of the architecture, and the innermost is going to execute at the thread level within the cores. So that's one of the purpose of tiling, to be able to allocate the computation into a particular computational unit of the GPU. So for the innermost, the thread one, usually they use values like 16, 30, 32, and 64, and powers of 2 for the remaining outer dimensions. And the outer dimensions that the possible options is t to the d, in the order of that. And t is the number of tile sizes, and this is the number of dimensions. But also, maybe another way you can compute this is basically the product of all the possibilities for all dimensions. It should be the same. It should be a large number. And they mentioned that in image processing, you can having 3 to 4 dimensional tensor operators are common, and also the pipelines could be quite large. And tiling the threads at the thread level. Now we tried at the we tiled at the block level. So we're gonna tile further. So once we tile the blocks, we're gonna tile the threads. And when tiling the threads, now you have another for loop inside of it, and this is serial, and it can be unrolled, as you can see in here, for both of them. So this is gonna explode input reuse. Also, it's gonna explode SIMD, instruction level parallelism, especially if we get the rolling. The rolling and the vectorization go hand in hand. And but reduces the parallelism at the block level. So usually you get parallelism in the outermost loop and vectorization in the innermost. Also may increase the strides of the memory access, reducing the bandwidth efficiency, and also the thread tiling options usually are small so that they can be unrolled in the innermost. So yeah, the tiling parameters between different loops are different. These are small, these could be larger. And you have hundreds of thousands of options, and there are some image processing pipelines with hundreds of stages with 4 or more dimensions, and puts an example here of a color. It seems like a hyperspectral image. Instead of 3 colors, it has 8 channels, and it has a well, let's say with 18 stages, 14 stages. Then they mentioned that this could have 3 million possible options, so it's a huge state space. So there's a need to reduce this state space to navigate it effectively, and that's what the paper is doing. One very important optimization in Halide is the fusion between stages. And this is something that gives Halide a special power because it's not the two extremes that you commonly see in compilers, like full inlining. For example, you have a consumer and a producer, and the producer shares all the for loops between with the consumer. I mean, the consumer and producer share all the for loops in a nested for loop. In that case, that is a full fusion. It's what they call inlining here. And I understand it should be the default optimization in Halide. And in that case, well, that's one extreme. The other extreme is that they are computed separately. So first you compute all the producer, do all the producer computations, and then do all the consumer computations. And that is the optimization, the scheduling primitive called compute root in Halide. But Halide offers the compute at, and yeah, this is like a partial fusion. It's an in between. You don't fuse all the for loops, so you share a set of for loops, but not all. So for example, if you want to fuse at the outermost loop, or you can fuse at the innermost loop, or you can fuse at the middle inner loop. So basically, in fusion in general, you are gonna improve memory locality, but at the cost of redundant computation. That's part of the trade-off navigation. It's not just the tiling, because also the tiling opens up opportunities for interstage fusion. Because for example, if you tile a for loop that is 2-dimensional into a 3-dimensional, now you have 3 different options, for the compute at. So that's part of the complication of the search space of these schedulers. Okay, so in here, in this example, we tiled the for loop of the consumer and producer in 3 different levels: the blocks, the threads, and the serial part. So we can fuse at the block level. So in that case, we are sharing the output, the outermost loop, and and you can see that the threads and serial are computed separately for the producer and the consumer. But we can also fuse inside the thread loop. If we fuse inside the thread loop, you can see that only the serial loop is repeated, and you can see that this can be unrolled, and they can both of them get SIMD vectorization. So you can see this more clearly in the GPU architecture. If you do the fusion at the block level, then the fusion is at this level. So you're gonna share the shared memory at the block level. But if the fusion is at the thread level, at the core level, then you can put your computation in the register level. So it depends. Sometimes one is going to be more convenient than the other, and that's the job of the autoscheduler, to find what is the right combination. So the scaling choices is at which level you're going to fuse between two stages, and which stage are you going to confuse. If you have a complicated pipeline, you have multiple options where to fuse a stage. Which stage do you fuse it? So those are parameters of the compute at a scaling primitive. Okay, the cost of evaluating an option could take seconds or minutes per choice. And that's why these autoscalers, like the Adams and the one presented here, rely on a cost model that is avoids you from having to evaluate that scheduling option to decide if you take it or not. One interesting observation of the paper is that they mentioned that long-term fusion is not necessary between stages where there's a high density in computation. For example, in a fully connected layers, dense layers that you are computed everything with everything, like a matrix multiplication. In that case, the long range fusion might not be that advantageous, and you can see that in pipelines that are in the MATLAB reinforcement learning toolbox, that usually for the critic and actor you get a bunch of stacks, fully connected layers. In those cases, especially if those are control problems where the array sizes are not that big, they usually are small, that also compounds the problem. But in the case of image and vision pipelines, the case is different. You don't have these high intensity arithmetic operations. They are more sparse, like the convolution, the max pooling. Those have small stencil kernels. In that case, using the compute at the partial fusion can be more convenient, and you have to navigate through the triangle trade-off of redundancy, locality, and parallelization. So it's quite convenient using Halide here, and that's what Halide was made for. It's a domain-specific language for image processing. And they mentioned that the TVM autoscaler does not do cross-layer optimization, this fusion, and is slower because of it. I will give a brief overview of the Anderson 2021 autoscaler now. As mentioned before, three of the main features are the hierarchical sampling, decision freezing on the schedules, and memoization that allows to effectively explore a large space of schedules, and that this is what is responsible for providing a significant speed up in the compile time of this autoscheduler. I will give more details on the three of them in a moment. And three major components of this autoscheduler are the enumeration of candidates. You get a set of scheduling candidates, and then they apply a structural hash to place them into buckets. And from the buckets, you sample some representatives. This should be part of the hierarchical sampling. Then you featureize the schedules and use the cost model to do use a variant of the beam search algorithm to expand the scheduling primitive chain. So that's your scheduling transform path, basically. So you expand it in different direction and pick up the best options, the top K. Then once you have the top K, you keep getting more candidates and repeat the process until you have at the end a top K scheduling chains and pick up the best one. And the best scheduling chain is what the set of scheduling primitives, the sequence and parameters that are going to be used for optimizing your particular pipeline. Okay, so they have a couple of three variants for the autoscheduler. One of them is the one-shot. This, I understand, is more for once you have your cost model trained, that you just query the cost model, and given the pipeline, it's gonna give you the best options, and you pick up one, and that's basically your optimized pipeline with the schedules. Okay, so this is more for deployment, I think. But well, if you this is the fastest one because there's no compilation of the schedules. You're going through a cost model. There's no benchmarking. But if you want to have more precision, you can go to the auto-tune path, which is basically you're gonna use the cost model in your beam search, and then you have the samples, but then you benchmark the performance and keep training the cost model, and keep on going, keep training the cost model. Search, you keep searching your scheduling primitive chain, and eventually you get the fast schedule. This is the slowest one, but the most precise. But then you have a in-between option in which you just use the cost model, like the one shot, pick up the top 5, and then you benchmark and pick up the actually faster one. Okay, now we're gonna go to the hierarchical sampling. Two of the three strategies, hierarchical sampling and schedule freezing, go together hand to hand in this part of the autoscheduler. If the strategy is basically just pay attention to the most impactful parts of the schedule. So for example, in here you can pay attention only to the top outermost for loop, and if you compare these two schedules relative to the frozen schedule, to the one in green, then they're gonna be the same. So you're gonna pick up one representative for each of them, and by doing this, you have less candidates to consider and less computation time, so your whole compilation process improves. But then as you get deeper into the transform chain, you can afford to be more granular. So you expand it a little bit. Once you expand the level, let's say to a second level, to a third level, then they are not the same anymore. So basically this should be two separate candidates. So that way, basically you keep the number of samples low and eventually get to the granularity level to do the right choices. As I mentioned before, as you keep pruning schedules according to their performance based on the cost model or the benchmarking, you can gradually increment the depth of the schedule. And for choosing the representative, they use the log2b options from the bucket. You can see that it's more than one. What they choose is based on that, and b is the number of schedules in the bucket. The freezing is at the stage level. So if you have a pipeline, for example a two-stage pipeline, you can find, okay, the first stage has the most impact on performance, so I'm gonna keep it that stage and I'm gonna freeze the second stage. So before that, they mention that they decide whether to inline or compute on their own kernels the stages, and then eventually the stages get unfrozen. And the author mentioned that this is similar, serves a similar purpose to the graph partition on TBM, but here all scheduling options for fusion between stages are considered. Memoization is the purpose of memoization is to avoid doing recomputations, and it is done at the featureization part when you're about to use the cost model, because for a particular schedule pattern, the featureization is going to be the same. So to avoid recomputing it, they just basically store it. This is basically going into the trade-off of memory versus runtime. So they sacrifice some memory for the sake of compilation runtime, and this is not done for the actual the runtime. They don't store the runtime, because the whole runtime, the performance is going to depend on the whole pipeline, so that changes depending on the pipeline. But the featureization for a particular segment of the schedule can be memoized. So here is an example of memoization. So you have a for loop like this, you compute the features and memorize it. Then you have another one that is exactly the same, and so basically you reuse those features for this one and save some computation time. But then after doing some transformation into this intermediate and output, then they get fused. Once they get fused, the for loop, the schedules, the for loops are not the same. So basically you have to recompute the features for this. Okay, now let's talk about the search algorithm, which is a variant of the beam search. As mentioned before, it's gonna pick up the top k candidates and that perform the best according to the cost model or the performance profiling. And the schedule during this process is represented as a loop nest structure. And for every decision, the optimizations are gonna transform this loop nest representation. As part of the scheduling process of finding the schedule, each level of the loop nest is gonna be labeled depending on the parallelism. For example, the top outermost loop usually is the uses parallelization and corresponds to the block level. The innermost correspond to the thread level and usually does vectorization and unrolling. Two of the most important decisions for the func, that is for the stage in the pipeline, is to how you're going to tile it and where you're going to do that computation. So those correspond to the tiling scheduling primitive and to the computed interstage optimization scheduling primitive. Going back to the fusion options, there are three main options. As I mentioned before, computing at the root level, which is compute root, inlining, or the in-between option, which is basically partial fusion computed. And there's a trade-off between parallelism, locality, and redundant computation between these options. And for compute root, it's basically not inlining at all, computed separately. Before compute the producer before computing the consumer totally. So this will exhibit a poor memory locality. Everything is stored in global memory, which is slow. There's an overhead of launching the producer in a separate kernel, and for the output, this is the only option because the output cannot fuse in any upstream stage. The computer has better memory locality. It could be depending on where you fuse it, as seen before. It could be at the thread level, it could be at the register level, which is faster than the global memory. But there's always limits to the hardware memory, and this depends on the particular target. So that's why you parameterize this scheduling primitive and the autoscaler. The job of the autoscaler is to get the optimal one. The computed scheduling primitive lets you navigate through the trade-off space. The deeper you get into the for loop, the more locality you get, but the more redundant computations you get. If you do compute at the block level, you get some redundancy and but less locality improvement. Then you get to the thread level, you get more locality. You can store your data at the register level, but the resources are less, and there's also more danger of spilling, which is costly, the dynamic allocations and spilling. And eventually you get to the extreme, which is compute inline, in which you get unacceptable levels of redundant computation, but this is very good for pointwise operations. For example, ReLU is a pointwise operation, so when you have a convolution layer followed by a ReLU layer, you do inline because it's a pointwise operation. So in this, when you are inlining, you don't have to consider tiling because you're sharing all the for loops. But if you're at the block level or compute root, then of course that particular stage needs to do tiling on it. The serial loops cannot be too large because otherwise they increase shared memory bank conflicts. That's why they use more powers of 2, like 1, 2, 4, and 8 for the serial loop. After choosing the serial loop size, then you go to the thread loops, and after that you go to the block loops. For the thread loops, you have to strike a balance between having an adequate number of size for the threads, but also without affecting the block level. And the sizes that you use for this loop level are favorable, should be compatible with the warp sizes. They use 16, 32, 64s, and powers of 2 up to 16 for the other dimensions. When you get to the block level, you aim to have sufficient parallelism, because usually the outermost loop, the block level loop, is the one that is used for parallelism, and they use twice the amount of streaming processors on the GPU to keep them busy, and because you don't want to have any of them idle. To avoid bad states, if they get a hash for a schedule for which they have seen a bad value, a bad performance before, they just apply a cost penalty and move it back to the queue, and they use hierarchical sampling for this. The hash for that bad performing schedule is used as a negative example for future trials. And for the beam search, they use a size of 32 with 5 passes and hashes up to depth of 5. That's the loop depth, I understand. And for the greedy case, the beam size is 1 and the with pass of 1 and hash depth up to 1 to the block level only. Once the schedule is assembled for the pipeline, it's ready to be lowered into a concrete implementation. There are two optimizations that they do. One of them is that the producers that at the thread level of their consumer will become register storage. That is, the store at is at the thread level, then that's going to become a GPU register. And serial loops, the innermost loop that has a total extent less than 16 will be unrolled, and that should help with SIMD warps and things like that. Now we go to the section of evaluating the schedules. This is for the cost model. The beam search algorithm is going to use the cost model to determine which are the most promising scheduling primitives to attach to the existing scheduling primitive chains. So yeah, the search space of the cost model of the beam search depends on this cost model, and it's based on features. The features are based on the algorithm and the schedule as well. And it's basically building on top of Adam's autoscheduler. It's the same, basically the same code base, but extended to capture GPU architecture characteristics. And yeah, they have a histogram of various arithmetic and memory operations for the entire algorithm in their cost model. The GPU extensions for the cost model capture how efficiently it is using the memory available in the GPU, and also how effectively it's using the block and thread level parallelization and the level of occupancy that it achieves in it. And the features are computed for each Halide func of the stage of the computation of the pipeline. The cost model includes details about the memory access, the warp, and memory footprint. They measure the ratio of the active warps versus the warp limit, the ratio of active blocks versus total maximum number of blocks in the hardware, and the ratio of shared memory to the actual limit of shared memory, to make sure that the warp blocks and shared memory are utilized as much as possible. The features are, as mentioned before, come from the algorithm and scale specific features, and they take the logarithm to compress the dynamic range of it, and they feed both of them to a couple of fully connected layers for the two embedding vectors, and they pass that to another fully connected layer that eventually is used to compute the cost for compute, load, store, parallelism, and working set. When training the cost model, as mentioned before, they use random pipelines and some machine learning operations, but it would be nice if they would train it with full deep neural network pipelines. Now we'll go to the results of this autoscheduler. Here is the benchmark that they used. Most of the pipelines used are for image processing. There's some deep learning that is also used for image processing and computer vision. So yeah, that's the main focus of Halide in general. Is good for the image processing and computer vision. They also have an IIR blur, this signal processing, and yeah, so basically they compare also against manually optimized schedules, and the manual human-made schedules for this experiment improve the results of the previous human-made schedules in the prior work. Before, I mentioned that they have three workflows for using the autoscaler: the one-shot, the top 5, and the autotune. So for all the benchmarks, they tried the three of them. For the case of the one-shot, they used 80 samples. The cost model was trained on random pipelines and also all applications except the one being tested. And yeah, so they do the ranking by the cost model, and this approach is comparable with the Ceutas in terms of performance, but as you can imagine, it's the fastest one. I understand it can run in seconds Yeah, it mentions it here. When you go to the next one, the top 5, this is more representative of what a human will do. Basically, find the best and do benchmarking on them and pick up the best. So yeah, this takes in the order of 1 minute. It's a little bit slower, but still this very good, and it should get a better performance. And then the auto tune, this is gonna benchmark everything and has more samples and takes the fastest one. It takes about 10 minutes to finish depending on the program, and this is gonna be in table 4. And but this is not that bad, although these pipelines, some of them are not very big. Okay, so they use both greedy and non-greedy for the beam search. So they had to do some post-compilation filtering. They filter out the cases where there was a spill of registers. They mentioned that this is hard to predict, and as a future work, the cost model should be able to somehow anticipate this to avoid this post-filtering of sample of test data. And this is the machine that they are using, and they are running the machine in isolation, and they found that there was no significant time spent in the CPU. Most of it of the benchmarking was done in the GPU. Most of the times of the benchmarks were spent on the GPU rather than the CPU. As you can imagine, the more time you spend on the autoscheduler, the better performance you're gonna get. So the one shot is close to CUTAS, then top 5 a little better, and auto tuning much better. And CUTAS did not consider all scheduling primitives, but this paper also says that it doesn't consider everything as well. But the manual schedule, the human-made schedules do consider everything. And yeah, so the autotune is close to the handmade schedules, but we are gonna see details on that on the tables later. With the results, they were able to prove empirically that the 3 strategies of hierarchical sampling, memorization, and schedule freezing, all of them are basically reducing significantly the state space. For the case in average, they evaluate 5% of the states, and in the case of the bilateral grid, they evaluate less than 1% of the total states. And if you evaluate less states, then it's easier to traverse your search space without losing efficiency. Here are the performance results of the Anderson autoscheduler versus the CUTAS autoscheduler. So you can see that the one-shot top 5 and auto-tune options were tried against the human expert, and everything is compared against the human expert. The human expert is the baseline, so that's why it has a value of 1. And you can see that CUTAS sometimes beats the human expert, but most of the time the human expert is better. And also the auto-tune version beats in many cases the human expert, like in max filter, Harris corner detection, stencil chain, matrix multiplication, lens blur, Laplacian, local Laplacian, bilateral grid, and sometimes even top 5 is able to beat it, like a stencil chain. I don't know if this is a real use case. Also max filter, but it can match sometimes the human expert, like interpolate, but autotune is gonna be closer to the human expert. But again, you don't always have the time to do the work of the human expert. So in that case, the Halide autoscaler is gonna do it for you. Okay, so here are the results of using. Basically, they are activating and deactivating the 3 options: the freezing and hierarchical sampling. So memorization is not here, but they're just using hierarchical sampling and freezing. So if both of them are off, here's the performance. So there's no a clear relationship in terms of performance. Throughput is what they are measuring here. You can see that sometimes when you have both off, it's worse. That is expected, but then you get things like the bilateral grid in which you have one of them off, and it is better like that. For the case of the purple one is for the top five. The cream, the other one is one shot. So you can see this is expected. This is expected, but then you have things like this when you have one of them off and you get the better performance. For the case of the top five, you this is expected, expected. This is expected, 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 expected. So the behavior is quite expected. But this, when you have both off in the stencil chain, it gets better like this, and also camera pipe as well. But for most of the cases, in the case of the top five, the performance is better. But the thing about the sampling and featureization is not to get a better performance, is to be able to get the compilation. I mean, the exploration process get done faster. That's the main purpose of this, and you're gonna see the advantage later. So you can see here the advantage of having both a freezing and hierarchical sampling on. So you can see that when both are on, you get the least number of states evaluated. Sometimes less than 1% for the case of blur and bilateral grid, and convolution layer 1%. If you have both off, then you're gonna evaluate everything 100%. So this is the main goal of these strategies, as it was mentioned at the beginning of the paper. And here is the empirical results for the usage of memoization, sampling, and freezing. When both are off, you get the highest compilation time, but when they are all on, you get the lowest compilation time. Usually, there are some exceptions. Camera pipe does compile faster when memoization is off, but notice that there's not much difference really. So it's like memoization doesn't do much of a difference in the camera pipe, which what will tell me is that there are not many redundant schedule features in there, so memoization doesn't make a difference. And in this one, you get almost the same. So you can see that in this case, sampling, hierarchical sampling, doesn't make a difference for some reason. But usually when you have the three on, you get a significant reduction in compile time, which is the purpose of them. And here is the view of the speed up. It's the same data as the previous table, but with speed up. And you can see when both are off, all off, then you get all ones. And in here you get the huge speed up on compilation time. That I think in average was 370 seconds. No, that's the number of seconds. It's a speed of a 49x. That's what they mentioned at the beginning of the paper in average. And in the best case, 530x. Here they compare the compilation time of the three alternatives of the Anderson autoscheduler, the one shot, the top 5, and the two tuning against the prior work in Ciutas. The one shot, as mentioned before, is almost the same as the Ciutas, and sometimes one is faster than the other, but most of the times these two are the fastest options. There's an exception in NL means that top 5 is the fastest, but when you go to top 5, you sacrifice some compilation time to get better performing scheduling, a better performing schedule. And again, auto tuning takes even longer, and you get an even better schedule. And here is the memory usage for memoization, and the impact most of the time is not that bad. This is on and off. There are some cases where it's bigger, but you're sacrificing memory for compilation time. In here we can see the precision of the predictions of the cost model. You have the blue one, which is without a retraining, and then the orange one, which is after retraining. The fastest predicted is in red, and the fastest actual is in purple. So you can see that in some cases the retraining helps. For example, in this one, after retraining you get closer. My bad, sorry. In the x-axis you're gonna have the predicted runtimes, and in the y-axis the actual runtimes. So you get the best prediction when you are under this line. So yeah, so for example, let's say that in this case the predicted time is this one, but the actual time was this one. So it's like 1.5, but it predicted that it was like 11. So it's a bad prediction. It's basically, it was not able to predict the fast schedule. And sometimes it does. You can see it like this one, like this one. Sometimes this one didn't need retraining, and this retraining helped to get it better. And this one as well. This one didn't make a difference. This one didn't make a difference, but was able to predict the fast schedule. So the accuracy is not perfect, and it's something that perhaps can improve. Okay, now I'm gonna briefly discuss the related work. There are some interesting comments in this section. One of them is that Halide, Halide is able to handle compute add and store add, which are interstage optimization, something that is difficult to express in Polyhedra. And also in the past, they had considered genetic algorithms over randomly generated schedules for the autoschedulers and Polymesh, but they have stepped away from that. And Polymesh is a polyhedral based autoscheduler that takes ideas from polyhedral literature and Halide and develops an automatic scale technique using a heuristic cost model and a greedy stage grouping algorithm, and then benchmarks over different tile sizes, and then later was extended in 2018. Other Halide autoscalers include the 2016 Mulapudi and Ciutas, and they basically use a similar heuristic cost model and greedy stage grouping. Ciutas use the same search algorithm, I guess, as Mulapudi, according to this, and but they don't consider the whole search space that Anderson is doing because of the techniques mentioned in this paper, I guess. And also they are limited in the scaling primitives that they use in their search space as well. Lee 2018 is another GPU autoscaler specialized for gradient code, but it only considers trivial loop fusion. Of course, there's the Adams autoscaler. I understand that should be the best so far for CPUs for Halide, and it has a combination of manually based cost model with deep learning for the cost model, and uses a beam search algorithm similar to the one used in this paper, which is an extension of it. And it doesn't perform well on GPUs, that's well known. And yeah, because it doesn't have this basically the purpose of this work. And yeah, of course, Utah is gonna perform better than Adams. And there's another publication by Steiner that proposed an improved cost model that includes the prediction of scalar stages in a pipeline, and it's only for CPUs. Now also there's AutoTVM. This is for another domain-specific language that is for deep learning, TVM. AutoTVM bases its search on templates, handwritten schedule templates. That's something that I don't like very much. It doesn't allow, I understand, the autoscaler to fully explore the possibilities. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. And the author mentioned that they use reinforcement learning algorithm for the search and gradient boost trees. But I understood that Answer doesn't use reinforcement learning. Answer is the one that uses it, unless they added in a recent publication reinforcement learning to their search. But then there's FlexTensor and Answer that relax the need to manually specify templates, and they seem to be imitating Halide in this one. There's a couple of interesting papers. And Tensor Comprehension employs polyhedral rewrites and automated tile sizes. In contrast to TVM, Anderson autoscaler explores a broader set of programming primitives, more diverse, and is targeted for lower arithmetic intensity operations, such as stencil chains that you often find in image processing pipelines. And he again mentions that this fusion between long range fusion between stages in a pipeline is crucial for these domains, and this is something it's good to see that he confirms what I suspected about the TVM autoscaler, that by using these templates you basically inhibit the long range fusion between stages. So that's something that is happening in this Halide autoscheduler. Both Andersons and Adams do it. Anderson for GPUs and Adams for CPU. And also he mentions that the technique of hierarchical sampling can be seen in the Chameleon autoscheduler, which is a reinforcement learning based autoscheduler. But in the case of Anderson is adapted to nested for loops. Okay, now let's go to the limitations and feature work related to the Anderson autoscheduler. And here's the summary of it. And even though they consider a large part of the state space for the search, still the search space is more larger still, so it can be further improved. In reduction, three of the improvements are centered around the reduction induction variables. And in order to enable them, these reduction improvements, they have to tile at the level of the update. Currently, they only tile at the level of the func. So by tiling at the level of the update, they enable reduction a variable unrolling that is important for convolution and IRR blur. These are two of the benchmarks that perform the worst. I mean, didn't perform very well in the profiling results. And also tiling at the update level is going to enable parallelizing reductions to include R factor and atomic scaling options, and this is important for histogram equalization benchmark. Also, as mentioned before, they have to extend the cost model to predict register speeding to avoid post-processing because of it. Now let's go to the cost model components, and for that I'll refer you to the paper, which I'm going to put into the description of this video, and you can see in the section B of the paper the different components. You compute the number of threads, the computed cost, the idle cost, wastage, the load cost, the memory, global memory, shared memory related components. You have the shared memory ones, the store cost, fault sharing. So they take into account different things that include GPU information. Yeah, and that will be it. And this is the total cost, which is the compute cost, store cost, load cost, and all of them are depending on inputs that are coming from the trained neural network that is feeding this, and based on this cost, the bin search takes over. Okay. Now let's go to an example. I did this Harris corner detection example, and it is basically the same example that is used for in the tutorial of Halide for the Adams autoscheduler. So it's a relatively complex image processing pipeline that is used for image registration. You can see here it can be used for feature matching, SLAM, camera calibration, 3D construction. So this is a schedule, and you can see that coming up with this manually is kind of painful. So you can see this is the algorithm and this is a schedule. So that's, you can see the separation of algorithm and schedule at its best right here. So this is the power of having the autoscheduler, and you can see all the different primitive GPU related primitives like GPU blocks, GPU threads, and you're gonna have the tiling with the split. The split is basically the tiling, and you're gonna have compute at some point. Some of them have compute root. There should be some compute at some place around here. I'm quite surprised that there's no compute in this case. If you see one, please write in the comments, but I don't see a compute or store which are interstage optimizations, and that's one of the main advantages that the paper talks a lot about. And my experience with the Adams autoscheduler is that you get often this compute and store scaling primitive to do this interstage optimization. And to use Anderson autoscheduler, you have, instead of putting where you write for Adams autoscheduler, instead of writing Adams 2019, you write Anderson 2021. And also the target has to change. It has to be a target with CUDA to be able to generate the schedule. And of course, you have to have a GPU in your machine to try it out. Okay, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching.